Somewhere out there, right now, in the dark, the sea is doing what it has always done. It rises and falls in long, slow swells that have been rolling across the water since long before anyone was around to watch them. The waves don't hurry. They have nowhere particular to be. They just keep moving steadily through the night. And somewhere along the edge of all that dark water, at the end of a rocky headland, or perched on a wave-washed island, or rising from a dangerous reef far from shore, there is a light. A slow, patient light. Turning, or flashing, or just glowing steadily. Sending its beam out across the water, across the miles, saying quietly to anyone who might be out there, "Here I am." Here is where the rocks are. Here is where the safe water begins. Come this way. That light is a lighthouse. And the story of lighthouses is a long and gentle one, stretching back thousands of years, full of patient people and clever inventions and the quiet, dependable business of keeping a flame alive through the night. Let's wander through it slowly. The sea at night is very dark. That might sound obvious, but it's worth sitting with for a moment. On land, even on a moonless night, there are things to help you find your way. Trees have shapes. Hills have profiles. A road has edges. But at sea, everything is the same in every direction. Water, 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 and then more water. And underneath some of that water, hidden just below the surface, or lurking as islands and rocks and reefs, are the things that can end a voyage very badly indeed. Sailors have always known this. For as long as people have gone to sea, and people have been going to sea for a very, very long time, the darkness was the problem. You could navigate beautifully during the day, watching the coastline, reading the shape of the land, following the birds. But at night, you couldn't see the rocks until you were almost on top of them. And by then, of course, it was far too late. So people began, slowly and cleverly, to put lights at the dangerous places. The very first lighthouses weren't really lighthouses at all. They were just fires. A fire lit on a hilltop, or on a cliff, or at the entrance to a harbor, burning through the night to tell sailors where the land was. Can you imagine standing on a dark shore, looking out to sea and keeping a fire going all night long? Feeding it wood, making sure it didn't blow out in the wind, watching the flames to make sure they burned bright enough to be seen from far away? That was someone's whole job. night after night after night. And it worked. A fire on a headland can be seen from quite a long way out to sea, especially on a clear night. Not for miles and miles perhaps, but enough. Enough to say, this is the land. Don't come any closer here. The harbor is over that way. The most famous lighthouse in all of history was built a very long time ago, over 2,000 years ago, which is so long past that it's hard to quite take in. It was built on a small island called Pharos, just off the coast of a great Egyptian city called Alexandria. And the lighthouse they built there was, by all accounts, astonishing. It was called the Lighthouse of Alexandria, or sometimes the Pharos. The island gave its name to the whole idea, and in quite a few languages today, the word for lighthouse still sounds like Pharos. Isn't that a lovely thing? A lighthouse built so long ago that the world has mostly forgotten it, but still so famous that its name echoed forward through the centuries and became the very word for what it was. The Pharos was tall, very tall. Different old accounts give different numbers, but most historians think it was somewhere between 100 and 140 meters high, which would make it one of the tallest buildings in the ancient world. It had 3 sections, one on top of the other, a square base, then an 8-sided middle section, then a round top section where the light was. And at the very peak, there was a statue, probably of the god of the sea, or perhaps of the king who built it. Nobody is entirely sure. The fire burned at the top, and some old accounts say there was a large curved mirror behind it, made of polished metal, which caught the firelight and sent it further out to sea. Whether that mirror really existed, we don't know for certain. But it's a wonderful idea, using a curved surface to gather up the light and throw it further, the same principle that would, much, much later, lead to one of the cleverest lighthouse inventions of all. The Pharos stood for over 1,000 years. It survived storm after storm, century after century. And it went on guiding ships into the harbor of Alexandria all that time. Eventually, 2 earthquakes weakened it so badly that it crumbled. But for a long time, it had been considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, alongside things like the pyramids and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. One of the 7 most remarkable things that humans had ever built. A lighthouse. One of the 7 most remarkable things in the world. There's something rather nice about that. After Alexandria, lighthouses spread slowly around the coasts of the world. The Romans built them because the Romans built everything. They had a rather vigorous approach to engineering problems. Roman lighthouses have been found along the coasts of France and Britain and Spain and Italy, guiding the ships that carried grain and wine and pottery and soldiers around the edges of their vast empire. When the Roman Empire eventually faded away and things got quieter and more uncertain in Europe, some of the lighthouses fell into disuse. The fires went out. And for a while, the seas got more dangerous again. But gradually, as trade picked up and cities grew and ships got more ambitious, people began building lighthouses again, one by one, along the most dangerous stretches of coast. And they had to figure out, each time, how to build them. Building a lighthouse sounds straightforward. You find a dangerous point of coast, and you build a tall tower with a light at the top. But in practice, it was sometimes extraordinarily difficult. Because the most dangerous places, the places where ships were most likely to run aground, were often the hardest places to build anything at all. Rocky islets, half submerged in the sea. Reefs far from shore with no dry land within miles. Exposed headlands, where the waves crashed so hard and so constantly that nothing seemed to want to stay standing. The places that most needed a lighthouse were sometimes the places where building one seemed almost impossible. And yet, people built them anyway. There are lighthouses standing on tiny rocks in the middle of the sea, where the builders had to work only during calm weather, stopping every time the waves came in, sometimes having to row back to shore for weeks until conditions were right again. Some lighthouse towers took years to finish. Some were swept away by storms halfway through construction and had to be started over. Some builders fell into the sea. Some drowned. It was hard, careful, patient work. And once a lighthouse was built, someone had to live in it or nearby and keep the light burning every single night. Which leads us to one of the most interesting people in the whole story. The lighthouse keeper. For most of lighthouse history, every lighthouse had one. Sometimes a keeper and an assistant keeper, especially at more remote or dangerous stations. Their job was simple to describe and quite relentless to actually do. Keep the light burning. Every night, without fail. Whatever the weather, whatever was happening, the light must not go out. Think about what that meant. The keeper lived at the lighthouse, sometimes in a cottage attached to the base of the tower, sometimes in rooms built into the tower itself. They were often in remote places. Some lighthouse keepers lived on tiny islands accessible only by boat. Some lived on headlands where the nearest town was a long walk away over rough moorland. Some manned lighthouses on exposed rocks where they couldn't leave at all during bad weather, which in some places meant they couldn't leave for weeks at a time. Their days had a shape. In the morning, after the night's work was done, they would tend to the lamp. cleaning the glass, trimming the wick, filling the oil reservoir so it was ready for the night ahead. They would record the weather in a logbook and the ships they could see passing and anything unusual that happened. And then, during the day, they might do maintenance on the tower, or tend a small garden if the location allowed it, or fish if the sea permitted. And then at sunset, they would light the lamp. And then they would stay awake, or take turns, staying awake if there were two of them, all through the night, watching. Making sure the light kept burning, adjusting the wick if it smoked, refilling the oil if it got low, watching the weather, watching the sea. And at sunrise, they would put the light out or shade it so it wasn't visible in daylight. And then they would sleep a little. And then they would do it all again. Night after night after night. Some lighthouse keepers loved the life. There was a quietness to it and a purpose. Every morning you could know that the light had burned all night and that somewhere out there in the darkness a ship had passed safely because of it. That is a rather satisfying thing to know about yourself. Some keepers wrote poetry, or painted, or read voraciously in the long night hours, while the lamp slowly turned above them. Some kept detailed journals that are now quite wonderful to read, full of descriptions of storms and birds and the behavior of the sea in different seasons. Some keepers were lonely, of course. The isolation was real. Weeks without talking to anyone new. Months without seeing a town. The same view from the same tower window, day after day. For some people, that was peaceful. For others, it wore on them. But they stayed. And they kept the light. For a long time, the light itself was a simple flame. A candle in some early lighthouses. Then oil lamps, which burned more brightly and more steadily. The oil came from many sources over the years. Fish oil, whale oil, olive oil, and eventually mineral oil, which is what we would call kerosene or paraffin today. But a flame on its own, however carefully tended, could only throw its light so far. And what lighthouse builders really needed was a way to send that light further, much further, out to sea. This is where things get rather beautiful. In the year 1822, a French engineer named Augustin Jean Fresnel, and his name is pronounced, roughly, Fresnel, in the French fashion, designed a new kind of lens. Not an ordinary lens, like the ones in spectacles, but something much more elaborate and much more clever. You know how a lens can take light and bend it, focus it, gather it up and point it in a particular direction? Fresnel's idea was to take that principle and scale it up dramatically. He created a lens built from many rings of glass, each ring carefully angled so that it caught a slice of the lamp's light and bent it forward out to sea. The rings were stacked concentrically, one inside another, each one slightly different, each one playing its part in gathering up every scrap of light the lamp produced and sending it outward in a focused beam. A Fresnel lens is beautiful to look at. It has a golden amber glow to it, and the many rings of glass catch the light and hold it, so that the whole lens seems to glow from within. They were made in different sizes. The very largest ones were enormous, taller than a person, weighing several tons, the glass so thick and so precisely ground that making one took months of careful work by skilled craftsmen. But the results were extraordinary. A lighthouse fitted with a Fresnel lens could be seen from much, much further away. Some of the larger lenses could throw a beam 30 or 40 miles out to sea on a clear night. 30 miles. Can you imagine seeing a light from 30 miles away across dark water? And the light floated on oil, or later on, a clockwork mechanism or a mercury bath, so that it could rotate smoothly, turning steadily and silently through the night, sending its beams sweeping out across the sea in a slow circle, over and over. Now, here is one of the cleverest things about lighthouses. There are a great many of them along any stretch of coast. There might be 10 or 20 lighthouses visible from a ship sailing along a particular coastline. How does a sailor know which one they're looking at? How do they tell the difference between the light at the entrance to one harbor and the light on a dangerous reef 5 miles up the coast? The answer is, each lighthouse has its own pattern. Some lighthouses show a steady, fixed light. Others flash. One flash every few seconds, or 2 flashes, or 3, with a pause in between. Some lighthouses have what's called a group flashing pattern, where they give 2 quick flashes, then pause, then 2 more, then 2 more, then 2 more, then 2 more. Some rotate so that the light comes around in a particular time, once every 10 seconds or once every 15. And the pattern is written down on the nautical charts that sailors carry, so a sailor can look at a chart and say, "Ah, that light flashes 3 times every 12 seconds. That must be the lighthouse at such and such a headland, which means I'm 10 miles north of where I thought I was." The sailors knew these patterns the way you might know the faces of people you see often. A particular rhythm of light in the darkness was as distinctive as a name. And the pattern is called, rather wonderfully, a lighthouse's character. Each lighthouse has its own character, its own way of speaking to the sea. But light can't always get through. There are nights and whole weeks of days when the coast is wrapped in fog so thick that you cannot see your hand in front of your face, let alone a light from miles away. Fog has always been the great enemy of navigation. You can sail carefully, slowly, listening and watching, and still not know where you are. And the rocks don't announce themselves. So lighthouses were given another voice. The foghorn. A foghorn is exactly what it sounds like. A very large horn, powered by compressed air or by engine, that sends a deep, resonant blast of sound out through the fog. The sound carries through the mist in a way that light cannot. And just like the light, every lighthouse's foghorn had its own pattern. One blast every 30 seconds or 2 blasts every minute, so that sailors could identify which lighthouse they were near, even when they couldn't see it. The sound of a foghorn is one of the most distinctive sounds in the world. It's low and melancholy and somehow ancient feeling, even though foghorns are a fairly recent invention. The earliest mechanical foghorns only appeared in the middle of the 19th century. Before that, lighthouse keepers would ring a bell in fog. A big bell on a tower struck by hand or by a clockwork mechanism, ringing out through the gray. Before bells, there were cannon. Some early lighthouse stations had a cannon that was fired at regular intervals in foggy weather to warn ships away. Can you imagine the lighthouse keeper in the middle of the night in thick fog, loading and firing a cannon every few minutes, over and over, through the dark? What a strange and effortful way to say, "Be careful. I am here." There is something rather wonderful about the geography of lighthouses, too. Because the sea doesn't arrange itself neatly for the convenience of lighthouse builders. Sometimes the most dangerous spot, the place most needing a warning light, is not a piece of land at all, but open water. A sandbank in the middle of a bay, shifting slightly each year with the currents, dangerous to ships, but nowhere near any shore. Or a long, shallow reef out in the middle of a busy shipping lane, miles from any coast. You can't build a lighthouse there. There's no rock, no land, nothing to build on. So people built floating lighthouses instead. They're called lightships or light vessels, and they're exactly what they sound like. Ships fitted with a lighthouse lamp at the top of a mast, moored in position above or near the dangerous place, and kept there permanently. The lightship would be anchored with a very heavy anchor and a very long chain, and it would ride the waves day and night, its lamp burning through the darkness, its foghorn sounding through the fog. The crew of a lightship had a strange life. They couldn't go anywhere. The ship was moored, fixed to one spot, riding up and down on whatever the sea was doing. In fine weather, it must have been peaceful. In storms, when the sea came up in great gray-green mountains and the ship pitched and rolled and the spray came over the deck and curtains, it must have been deeply uncomfortable. But the light had to stay on. And so the crew stayed with it. Some lightships served their stations for decades. They became as familiar to sailors as any fixed lighthouse. that particular red hull, that particular mast, that particular character of light. When a lightship was moved for maintenance or repair, there would be notices issued to all sailors. The lightship at such and such a place is temporarily absent. Extra care is advised. And sailors would be extra careful and would be genuinely relieved when the familiar red hull was back on its station. Some lighthouses have become so well known that they feel almost like characters themselves. Let me tell you about a few, just gently, just in passing. There is a lighthouse in France called the Fer d'Ecmaux, which stands on a rocky headland in Brittany and is made of local granite, pale grey-blue in color, with a tall, elegant tower and a light that shines out over the Bay of Biscay. It was funded by the will of a French noblewoman who wanted to leave something useful to the world after she died, and it was completed in 1897. It is quite beautiful. The kind of lighthouse that you look at and think, yes, that is exactly right. That is exactly what a lighthouse should look like. There is a lighthouse in the United States called Cape Hatteras on the coast of North Carolina, which stands in an area so notorious for shipwrecks that it earned the nickname the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The currents there are complicated, and the shoals are shifting and treacherous, and for centuries ships were lost there with terrible regularity. The lighthouse that now stands there is the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States. Nearly 60 meters high, painted in a distinctive black and white spiral pattern, so it can be identified during the day as well as by its light at night. In the late 1990s, something remarkable happened to Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. The shoreline had been eroding for years, and the sea was getting closer and closer to the tower. Eventually, it was decided that the lighthouse had to be moved. Moved. The entire tower, all 420,000 kilograms of it, lifted gently onto a system of steel beams and rollers and walked, very slowly, on a specially constructed track about half a mile inland to safer ground. It took nearly 3 weeks. The whole thing moved at about 23 meters per hour, which is incredibly slow even by lighthouse standards. And it worked. The lighthouse now stands safely inland, still functioning, still turning its light. The same tower that has stood there since 1870 just moved. Rather like a lighthouse keeper, really. Patient, steady, unhurried. And then there are the really extraordinary ones. The ones built not on headlands or islands, but on actual rocks in the open sea. Places where the sea never truly calms down, where a moderate storm produces waves that can reach the top of a 10-story building. The Eddystone Lighthouse off the coast of Plymouth in England sits on a small rock called the Eddystone Rock, about 14 miles south of the coast. The rock is barely larger than the lighthouse that stands on it. There have been 4 lighthouses on the Eddystone Rock over the years. The first was made largely of wood and was destroyed in a catastrophic storm in 1703, taking its builder down with it. The second was also wooden and was destroyed by fire. The third was built from interlocking granite blocks, each one shaped so that the whole tower locked together like a 3-dimensional puzzle, so strong that even the enormous waves couldn't dislodge it. That tower stood for over 100 years before it had to be replaced, not because it had been damaged, but because the rock beneath it had begun to shake from the constant pounding of the sea. The builders of rock lighthouses developed remarkable techniques. They could only work at low water, when the rock was briefly exposed. They would row out in small boats, land on the slippery wave-washed surface, work as quickly as possible, and then row back before the tide came in. Some days they could only manage an hour of work. Sometimes bad weather kept them ashore for a week. Building a lighthouse on a small rock in the sea could take 4 or 5 years, and in some cases, longer. The work was patient, difficult, and occasionally very dangerous. But when those lighthouses were finished and first lit, the feeling must have been extraordinary. Standing at the top of that tower for the first time, watching the light go out over the sea for the first time, knowing that ships would be safer now, that the darkness had one more fixed point of kindness in it. For most of history, lighthouse lamps burned oil. And then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, electricity began to change everything. Electric light was brighter and more reliable than oil lamps. It didn't need a keeper to constantly trim the wick and refill the reservoir. It could be controlled more easily, switched on and off, made to flash in precise patterns by simple clockwork or electrical timer mechanisms. Gradually, lighthouse after lighthouse was converted to electricity. And then came something that changed the life of every lighthouse keeper in the world: automation. An automated lighthouse has no keeper. The light comes on at dusk and goes off at dawn, all by itself. The foghorn sounds in fog, all by itself. Monitoring equipment checks that everything is working and sends an alert to a distant control center if anything goes wrong. A technician visits occasionally, once a month perhaps, or less often, to do maintenance. But day to day, night to night, the lighthouse runs on its own. In most countries, the last lighthouse keepers were retired or reassigned in the 1990s. It was a gentle end to a long tradition. There weren't protests or drama. It was simply that the technology had become good enough and reliable enough that a person didn't need to be there anymore. The last keepers handed in their logbooks and their oilskins and went to live ordinary lives, and the lights went on turning without them. It's a little bittersweet, perhaps. The image of the lighthouse keeper. That solitary, patient figure tending the flame through the long night is such a vivid one that it's hard not to feel a small wistfulness at its passing. But then again, the light is still there. The beam is still going out across the water. The purpose is unchanged. Only the hand that tends it is no longer needed. Technology has changed navigation enormously in other ways too. Sailors today have GPS, a system of satellites that can tell a ship's position anywhere in the world, to within a few meters, at any time of day or night, in any weather. They have radar, which can see other ships and coastlines through fog and darkness. They have detailed electronic charts that show every sandbank and reef and rock, updated constantly. A modern ship's bridge is full of glowing screens, each one showing a different picture of where the ship is and what's around it. And yet, lighthouses are still there. Most of them still work. Sailors still note them on their charts, still navigate by them when they can, still feel reassured by the familiar flash of a lighthouse they know. Because GPS can fail, screens can go dark, batteries can run out, and when everything electronic stops working, the lighthouse is still there, its light still turning, doing exactly what it was designed to do. There's something very reliable about a lighthouse. It doesn't need the internet. It doesn't need updating. It doesn't need a signal. It just needs a source of power and something to turn. And it turns, and the light goes out, and the sea is a little safer. It's worth thinking, just gently, about how many ships have been guided safely to shore by a lighthouse light they never even thought about afterward. Thousands and thousands of voyages over hundreds of years. A sailor sees the familiar flash. One long, two short, recognizes it, marks the position, adjusts course slightly, and carries on. Never thinks about it again. The lighthouse did its job, and nobody particularly noticed, because when something works perfectly, there's nothing to notice. Nothing went wrong. The ship arrived safely. The cargo was unloaded. The crew went home. All those invisible journeys made possible by a light on a tower. There is something in that which feels important and rather lovely. A lot of the best work in the world is like that. Quiet, patient, steady, and mostly invisible. You never notice the lighthouse when everything is going well. You only need it when you're in trouble, in the dark, in uncertain water, not quite sure where you are. And And then there it is, turning slowly, sending its beam out across the miles, saying in its patient, wordless way, "Here. Here is a fixed point. Here is something you can trust. Come this way." The Fresnel lens, that beautiful stacked ring of glass, is still used in some lighthouses today. Many old lenses have been removed and placed in museums where visitors can stand close to them and see how the light catches each ring of glass and refracts and bends and glows. They're quite hypnotic to look at. All that careful geometry, all those precisely ground surfaces, all working together to take a single small light and throw it 30 miles across dark water. In museums, the lenses are usually lit and turning slowly, the way they would have been in a working lighthouse. And watching them is rather like watching a slow, underwater creature turning in the deep. That same unhurried rotation, that same quality of patient, purposeful movement. And the light inside the lens. It changes as you move around it. From one angle, it's soft and golden. From another, the refraction creates tiny rainbows in the glass. From another, it seems almost solid, almost orange, before it clears to white again, all from one small lamp. All from all those rings of glass, each one doing its small part. Somewhere right now, in the dark, a lighthouse is turning. Maybe it's on a rocky island off the coast of Scotland, where the wind is probably blowing and the sea is a deep Atlantic gray. Maybe it's somewhere warmer, the Mediterranean, or the Caribbean, or the long Pacific coast of Japan. Maybe it's on the Great Lakes, that enormous stretch of fresh water in North America where ships travel like ocean vessels, and where the winter storms can be as fierce as anything the sea can manage. Somewhere, a light is turning. One flash, two flashes, a pause. Or a steady beam, slow and patient, sweeping across the water. The same as it was 100 years ago. The same as it will be 100 years from now, probably. The sea changes, and ships change, and navigation changes, and everything around the lighthouse changes, but the lighthouse itself stays. It turns. Its beam goes out. There's something very settling about that. In a world that changes very quickly, lighthouses change very slowly. They stand at the edge of the land, where the solid world meets the moving water, and they do the same thing they have always done. A fixed point in the dark. A steady light in the uncertain night. The sea rises and falls. The beam sweeps around. The miles of dark water carry the light as far as it will go. and somewhere out there, perhaps, a ship adjusts its course just slightly. The navigator notes the familiar pattern in a logbook. The crew sleeps on in their bunks below deck, not knowing, not needing to know. The lighthouse did its job, and nothing went wrong. And the light goes on turning, slow and sure, through the long, quiet dark.